It is Sunday, June 7th, 2020. And as many know, we are now in about the ninth or so day of nationwide protests and riots in regards to just a culmination of deaths, but really as a result of George Floyd, as well as Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, two of which have been killed by police. The other one has been killed by two vigilantes. And so what we've seen in Atlanta over the last few days is something that's mirroring across the world and now across the globe, which is this notion of protest. And my guest today is somebody who I would consider arguably top five journalists working right now in the city of Atlanta. He is always, like, when we talk about like what a beat reporter could be, we talk about what an editor could be, we talk about what somebody who's in the new media space and is handling it pretty well. His name is Sean Keenan. You've probably seen his work in Curbed Atlanta, and we'll start with there. But you've also seen his work in the Saporta Report, or you name a publication in Atlanta, he has been published in it. He granted me some time today to talk to him about what's going on with the protests, and we're going to spend the majority of the conversation focusing on the protests and what's going on in that space. But before we do that, I want to talk to Sean about Curbed Atlanta and the state of the media, and then we're going to end on the protests. So without further ado, I'm going to let my guest introduce himself. So here is Sean Keenan.
Hey there, I'm Sean. I apologize profusely if you can hear the dog barking in the background. I am a freelance journalist in Atlanta. Like King said, I have worked for, feels like just about every local publication under the sun. I mean, with a few exceptions. I used to be the associate editor of Curbed Atlanta, which at the moment is not operational. During the coronavirus pandemic, or as it started to ramp up, the Vox Media brass determined that they would be consolidating, I guess, some of their Curbed operations and turning Curbed National into a subsect of New York Magazine. So a lot of the city sites had to be shut down. We were told we were put on an indefinite pause, but I have not been made aware of any progress as far as turning the site back on, which I feel like is a real loss for Atlanta. I mean, Curbed had been, I think, a valuable resource for people who want to stay in touch with the, developments of the city that have really made Atlanta what Atlanta is today. And obviously, King, you've done a lot of writing about how we're looking at a very new Atlanta, especially as it relates to, the way our real estate market is developing and the way that some of that growth has spurred what a lot of people will lump into just one word called gentrification, which has massive connotations. You could look at it from a purely economic standpoint, a racial standpoint, but at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest side effects of that development and that gentrification is displacement. And I thought Curbed was one of few outlets that was really keeping its finger on the pulse of the city with regards to its growth and the way that its culture adapted to that growth. Incidentally, during the pandemic, Curbed had never seen better readership numbers. We were looking at almost 2 million reads a month, and I guess ultimately the higher ups determined that it would be financially beneficial to break things down and sort of focus them from a more national lens. Some of the Vox publications didn't fare so well. Some have stayed alive just fine. It's my understanding that Eater is still, or at least Eater Atlanta and some of the other local chapters of the food blog there have stayed alive just fine. So, it's obviously like a very strange time to be in journalism. Curbed, I think, is the third publication that I've ever reported for that essentially doesn't exist anymore. We can talk about creative loafing all day. I don't want to badmouth the publication, but it's obviously very different. It's operating in a very different capacity from what we saw just 5 years ago. And yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind to be in this industry right now, especially as a guy. I graduated from Georgia State in the last class of print journalism majors, and that major just doesn't even exist anymore. Now it's called multimedia or mass media or something along those lines. So yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. this is a line of business that you can't be in if you don't absolutely love it. And I am obsessed with this profession, but it is sometimes tough to be in.
Right. And so I want to say this to you all. Like I said, Sean is like one of the 5 or 10 best journalists in Atlanta. And I seriously mean that. Read all of his work if you can. I know there's a breadth to it.
You're too kind.
But I will say this, though. In regards, I want to talk about just where the state of media is right now, because it seems as if for the last decade or so, we've talked about the death of print media for the most part. And we've also now starting to see furloughs of journalists across the board on every type of medium. And so in your opinion, where do you see journalism at just 20, not even a full 10 years, at just like 24 months from now? Where do you see journalism at?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. I've always wanted to believe that journalism is one of those industries that is invaluable. You can never replace it. You can't automate it. I know, especially in the, towards the tail end of the 2000s, the 2010s, we've been talking about a lot of jobs being automated, replaced by robots, AI, or whatever. I think journalism is one of the remaining fields where there is an important mix of art and, I don't know if science is the right word, but research and just diligent understanding of the subject matter that you're trying to cover. And so I don't see how you could take or make that any less important. And as our world evolves, it's becoming more crucial by the day. I mean, especially if you look at some of the people that are ruling the world, specifically the leader of, the so-called free world right now is clearly not a friend to journalists. Where some of us are, we've been nicknamed the enemy of the people, which is absurd and insulting and scary. And I used to tell this joke. Let me know if I'm getting too.
No, listen. No, you're good. You're good.
So every Thanksgiving, my mother will ask the family to go around the table and say what they're most grateful for the entire year. And 2017, 18, 19, I used to tell this joke. Well, I'm just grateful that my job's not illegal yet. And every day it's becoming less funny.
Yeah.
It's becoming a little more scary. And I'm not going to go out on a limb and say we're on the cusp of total dictatorship or anything like that. But there's this wild tension out in the world right now where, so much misinformation has been tossed around that finding a sense of trust among what so many people call the media. And I hate that.
Listen, you're taking the words out of my mouth.
Term. It's like saying I don't like people. It's a colossal collection of people. There's everybody from 14-year-old on Twitter who covers a protest with a cell phone. He's the media. Fox News is the media, and New York Times is the media.
Right.
It's just too big a word to condemn an entire industry. And I've also always thought it was very important to, instead of just blindly trusting an entire organization, find journalists that you trust. Sure, not everybody thinks the New York Times is doing the justice on some fronts. I mean, I think it's a fantastic publication, goes above and beyond, but it's got its problems too. But you should know which reporters you can trust. I mean, it's
true.
Not everybody is being puppeteered, if that's the right word.
Right, and I want to stick on that for a second, which is this notion of journalists being enemies of the people, because we've seen, like you said, we've seen over the last couple of years how that's kind of turned into a very, very dangerous profession. And the last 9 or 10 days have shown, I think literally at this point in real-time video daily, of journalists either being arrested, being assaulted, or, heckled by officers, by whoever. And I'm glad for what you're doing. And that's kind of the reason why we're here today. And we're not going to quite get in there yet. But it does seem as if the profession of journalism has essentially been divided into 2 phases, one of which is people who are, your standard traditional journalists. They believe and uphold the values. And then there's this other version of journalism that I'm going to say, not your words, that I think has become more, I don't even want to say journalism as much as it is, I'm going to give you a perspective.
Yeah.
And that's nothing wrong with perspective. I write about perspective. I write in perspective a lot, but there does seem to be a general difference in those two things. And with that said, do you disagree with that statement, or do you think that there's something I'm not missing, or I could be speaking more to?
No, that's spot on. I think there's a really blurred line, at least for some people, between punditry and news reporting. And, you
Right.
can hear the president all day call the New York Times or CNN fake news for a story that doesn't sit right with him. But at the end of the day, it seems like a lot of people are just overlooking the, pretty sizable line right here that says opinion
Right.
or perspective or analysis or things like that. I mean, there's a difference between going out on the streets and like chronicling things minute by minute and adding no personal context to it at all, and then what a lot of columnists do. And I think
Right.
there's a need for columnists and opinions, but as long as it's well well noted that this is not just the hard and fast facts. That I don't know. I mean, I'm probably straying from the point here, but
No. I mean, I say this because I think you're one of the last. I'm going to say this millennial generation. I think that you're one of the last groups of people I think who can do both really well. Now, I could be honest with you, even myself sometimes. I feel like I do better at just like the perspective than I do the standard day-to-day journalism, because I'm always trying to give in context and things like that. But you're excellent at just like here's the facts, here's what actually is going on. And I like that about you. And so one of the things I want to ask you in particular in regards to that is, it does suck for somebody like you who's out in the field and people like the president and people who support the president starting to call you the enemy of the people and things like that. Do you ever feel afraid for your position? Do you ever feel afraid for your safety because you're out there constantly?
um, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a case by case situation. Like just during the protests, for instance, I mean, I've marched with the people 6 days or so. I have never felt the slightest bit threatened or intimidated by the demonstrators. But then once you get up to the Capitol and you face that wall of law enforcement, like you got Atlanta police, SWAT. I saw a few FBI guys the other day,
Mm.
National Guard, and they start strapping on their gas masks and, their riot shields. It's just like, I mean, there's something daunting about that. I've seen, plenty of reports of journalists being targeted at the protests. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't sit right with me, but like the other day I was at a protest and I asked if I could hop the police line, go back and see if I could talk to some cops, because I'm really interested in the process of being able to deploy tear gas. I've been tear gassed 3 times in the past
Oh,
week.
wow.
And like,
Okay.
I just, obviously it wasn't headed straight toward me, but I got the residual effects of it. And one cop comes up to me and he pulls up my press badge, which had actually an Atlanta magazine credential from when I was reporting at the State House. So this was given to me by state government officials.
Mhm.
And he said, well, you could have printed that. I said, well, yeah, I could have, but it's not Halloween. I'm not dressing up. I'm here to, do my job. I'm here to keep an eye on you, keep an eye on the situation around here. And I was just kind of like taken aback by the distrust. I didn't know if he thought I was some like a demonstrator trying to infiltrate or something. It just confused the heck out of me. But like, to your mention of whether I ever feel that my safety is at risk, during the protests, there's always at the back of my mind some of the videos of journalists getting tear gassed or pepper sprayed or shot with rubber bullets. But then there's, even before all this, covering Trump rallies, you wear the press badge on your neck, and it's sort of like a scarlet letter. People are just flicking you off. People who've never met you in your life, probably don't know what publication you work for. I mean, hell, I could have been working for Fox News and they would have known it. All it said was press. And,
Right.
You get the impression like some people seem to be watching you the whole time. I went to one Trump rally in Macon, and I swear some guys wanted to follow me to my car. I had to duck out. And, don't let me like, I'm not going to accuse all of the Trump base of wanting to hurt journalists or anything, but there, sometimes there's something in somebody's eyes that,
When there's smoke, there's fire.
yeah.
Like, but I say that because It is honestly dangerous. We've seen people from CNN live on camera actually be pelted by rubber bullets. We've seen them be arrested. In the case of the one guy from CNN who got arrested on camera, I forgot his last name. The Spanish guy, the Afro-Latino guy, I forgot his name.
I want to say Oscar Jimenez.
Yeah, I think that's who it was. And so
I'm happy butchering that.
yeah, and so like no, and it concerns me because for this one, I've mostly sat out all of the protests. I will always go like afterwards or right before stuff. I don't actually go when things are going on because I have like a different needs. I have somebody I take care of, and so I can't like necessarily be on the front lines like you are.
Yeah.
And the thing I get constantly, and maybe I know you get this probably 10 times as much, as people who am aware I work in journalism, and they say, "Hey man, are you okay?" Or "Hey man, how's it going?" Or people just starting to check up on you now because we understand like that rhetoric has a real impact on things. And so I want to kind of take a bit of a turn in regards to that, which is now we've been here. I think, when did the first protest happen in Atlanta? Was it the 30th or the 31st or the 27th? I can't remember.
It was Friday.
Maybe the 25th, 26th, or even
Friday. It was the 29th.
Okay, yeah, the 29th. And so you've basically been out there since it started for the most part.
Yeah.
And
I
want
have admittedly taken, I think, 2 days off.
Okay.
I'll probably be out there tonight too.
Okay, and I want to talk to you because I think for a lot of people who listen, you're going to be the first voice in which that's not necessarily, and this is going to sound awful, but it's not from like the local Fox 5 affiliate, and it's not from somebody reading third person through the New York Times. And both of those essentially, they have their pluses and minuses in the coverage. I'm not going to diss them. But you are the first journalist they're going to hear who's been down there for the majority of the time. What do you want to tell people about your experience being out there on the front lines covering a protest and some of the days in which it's become a riot?
I want to say that what I'm mostly seeing is just a beautiful display of solidarity and, Atlantans showing their knack for peaceful protest. It's by and large been, I don't want to say calm because that's not the right word. It's rowdy, but it's an important rowdy. And, 99% of the protests, 99% of the day, it just, it feels like another Atlanta March for Justice. Definitely Friday and Saturday, the first Friday and Saturday, things got kind of dicey. What I've been thinking a lot about this is like as far as the themes of what I'm seeing is I'm sad, I'm angry, but I'm also white, and what I'm feeling right now pales in comparison to what what the people of color are dealing with at these protests, and like not even just at these protests, but people of color are dealing with like every day. And I've been dwelling on this one moment, losing a little bit of sleep over it because I think it was this past Friday when a friend of mine let me borrow a gas mask and an armored vest, and as the clock hit curfew.
No, you're good.
As the clock hit curfew, we had gotten to this point where it seemed like just about every day, once curfew struck, the police would start moving in on the protests. And just about every day, that meant that water bottles would fly from the protest side, and then tear gas would be returned by the law enforcement side of things. And as I'm like sitting there on the front line this past Friday, I've put my gas mask on, I've got an armored vest on, and I was like just shoving business cards in protesters' faces. I was like, I wanted.
We have a little guest next door. It's all good.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. And if you need me to go inside, I understand.
No, you're good.
It's my best backdrop. As I'm shoving business cards in people's faces, because the New York Times bureau chief Richard Fawcett asked me to, monitor things, but also just like keep in touch with the protesters, find out, if somebody gets arrested, even if somebody doesn't get arrested, how long have you been out here? We want to like maybe put together some sort of a bird's eye view report on, what's changed. I covered these protests in 2016, and a big question in my mind is what's changed. But to go back to this one instance, as I'm like shoving business cards in this face, I'm giving a business card to this young black woman, probably about my age, and I noticed she looks wary of me, and it occurred to me like, oh my God, I'm wearing a gas mask right now. There's nothing okay with this.
Right.
First of all, journalists, protesters, we shouldn't have to be armoring up to just cover police. And just it crushed me. I mean, I realized, like, holy cow, I'm probably scaring this girl right now. And but like, it almost felt like, just in the course of a week, I'd kind of normalized it. I just expected to be tear gassed that day.
Hmm.
And I mean, that doesn't sit right with me. I don't know what role I can play in changing things with that regard, but
But you're already doing it because you're on the front lines reporting what's going on. So
yeah, I mean, I'm trying, but I guess like every camera out there counts.
right. And so I want to actually ask you about that, because now I'm going to ask you a few questions. If you aren't able to answer them, just let me know. One of which is just the riot itself, right? So some people are saying, we're going to take this down piece by piece. One of which is the first day in particular, the riot on the first day. So there's a lot of people who assumed that the riot just kind of happened. Like the protests turned into a riot, but there is a bigger explanation of what actually happened that first day. Can you explain to people what happened?
Yeah, so I showed up, I want to say around 7:30 on Friday. And at that point, a lot of the protesters had made their way down the Centennial Olympic Park Drive bridge, which fronts the CNN Center.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's my understanding, I've heard from other accounts, like I showed up as they were already there and tensions were flaring. It's my understanding that the protesters, they were ready to just rove around town for hours, well into the odd hours of the morning. And then police tried to stop them at the CNN Center and essentially, like, turn the protest around, start to tell them it's time to go home. And it's my understanding, based on the account of dozens of protesters and journalists that were there on the scene, that had the police not attempted to stop the movement, it probably would have carried on just, in the massive droves that had already throughout the day been entirely peaceful. And that's not to say that, I'm reluctant to speculate too much, but from the perspective of some of these accounts, the police instigated the beginnings of the unrest. And so when I got there, 7:30 or 8 p.m., I'll have to check my videos, a bunch of cop cars had already been smashed, the ones that they tried to drive into the crowd to stop the roving protest. And one cop car was just being set on fire. And there was a wild mix of emotions in the crowd, obviously. We could talk all day long about the merits and pitfalls of rioting and the difference between rioting and looting. Obviously some people were cheering on the turmoil, and others were saying, we got to stop this. We started this as an incredible peaceful protest. We need to keep it that way. So, I mean, it's not my role to I guess weigh in on what or the importance of protesting versus rioting versus looting. But I know a lot of people that saw a lot of those demonstrations that sometimes devolved into chaos or violence. They saw those as really crucial cries for help.
Right. And so one of the things I also want to make clear is that I saw a lot of the protests as well, like just from TV, because I had to be at home.
Mm-hmm.
There was something I will say. You got there about 7:30. As somebody who watched the local news here cover most of the protests all day, which is something I think people are kind of going to get lost in the sauce about this. And there's a general maybe hour or two gap when it seems like the protests over to what you said. It seems as if, I guess, the police are trying to stop the ongoing marches of it. And so I do agree with you on that regard. Somebody who's seen it third person through the television,
Mm-hmm.
It felt very odd, because it felt as if, like you said, like it seemed like, because this is Atlanta, I've been to a few of those protests, like they just kind of die out on their own. And the moment like no one, it seemed like, could move and things like that, I was like, okay, this isn't going to go well. And it seemed to be a general lag between people just sitting there, and then eventually, like you said, the cop car being caught on fire, people smashing things, and then would turn into looting. And so, like, first, like, I guess people say it's a riot and then gets into looting. But it brought something interesting to me, which is the moment that happened, the moment I heard Jovita Moore's voice on Channel 2 Action News start to tremble because she's kind of confused, I knew then that the narrative about what this protest was going to be about had pretty much changed and changed overnight.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask and say that because once that narrative had changed, it seems as if every single day after the protest, the only thing that I would see on local TV, not you or your writing, is just this notion of destruction of property, looting, criminality, why we need to enforce the curfew. Did you
Yeah.
feel any of that while you were out there on the front line? Because I could tell you how it looked when I saw it, but I don't know how it felt to be out there on the front lines day 2 and onward.
Sorry, what feel like? Are
Did
you
you
talking
feel
about?
that like that kind of like force and that kind of, I guess the crackdown is the best way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, and I know what you're talking about with the narrative. Like, it's easy. I've been trying to, not just document the good or the bad. I'm pretty much just trying to put everything I see out in the open. And so I've, caught some flack for, taking video of police praying with protesters, and
Mhm.
I've taken some flack for, videotaping people breaking windows and, throwing fireworks at officers. So yeah, I mean, the mood was, it was obviously very tense, but I'm really hung up on this word violent that's
Right.
been tossed around so much in some of the local TV reports, and a lot of them have been doing a good job. I think CBS 46 has been doing a bang up job at like covering the protests pretty comprehensively. But even so, that word violence just carries such weight in a headline.
Mhm.
And I guess we could parse the definition of violence for hours, but when I think of that word, I think of a person being hurt, not a not a window
Of a
or
chain restaurant being smashed open, right? Like,
right.
yeah.
um and so yeah, I mean, but like I said earlier, I never felt scared by the protesters. I mean, I knew that there was a nearly 100% chance that none of them were going to try to attack me. I definitely,
Mhm.
don't get me wrong, it got really hot, it got really hairy Friday, Saturday. There was a point where I was really wishing that I was wearing a helmet as they were at
Mhm.
the Omni Hotel, and they're throwing rocks up at the glass, probably 3 stories high, and it's just glass raining down, and protests are narrowly dodging getting their heads cut up. But it didn't seem like nobody was trying to hurt other people. I didn't see anybody trying even to hurt police.
Right.
But, I mean, I saw police absolutely hurting protesters. I mean, we could argue the justification of that until the ends of the earth. But if one protester shoots a bottle rocket at one cop, do 2 dozen people deserve to be like bleeding out their eyes because they've been tear gassed? I mean, how does that calculus work?
Right. And so I want to ask about that, which is this notion of tear gas, because it seems now apparently online on Twitter, people are talking. Some people are mentioning, is tear gas effective, or is tear gas actually harmful, or does it really draw in pain? You've been out there. You say you've been tear gas 3 times.
Yeah.
In your opinion, your experience, is tear gas actually painful?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it sucks.
Okay.
Um, I don't mean to be so flip about that. It's
No, I mean that's what I ask, because some people online are saying, well, you know how people, everyone does their challenge, like it's just pepper. You can wash your eye out. It's not that big a deal. But I mean,
um,
I
so
kind of want to bring that up.
yeah, I have lots of research regarding like the chemical components in it, and I was talking to 2 SWAT guys 2 days ago who said that they've changed the type of tear gas they're using. I think National Guard is allowed to use a different tear gas than police are, but
Hmm.
like one is called OC gas and one is CS gas, and I can't remember which is which. But yeah, I mean, like when I was first videotaping the first dispatches of tear gas that I saw, which is on Marietta Street, just outside the CNN Center and the Omni Hotel. I went into like gung ho reporter mode. I was just like, all right, I'm going to get as close as possible. I thought that I
Yeah.
could kind of like dance through the clouds, and as long as I wasn't in them, I would be fine. But no, I mean, the poison is like
Wow.
invisible outside of those big plumes. If you're 10 yards away, you're going to start tearing up. You're going to start choking. And this, like, I was lucky enough not to be in an actual cloud of it where, I saw tons of protesters. Like, it took me probably 20 minutes for my eyes to stop running. Like my whole face was sweating. Like I didn't have a stuffy nose or a cold or anything, but my nose was running profusely.
Mhm.
So I had to go and take like a 10-minute break in Centennial Park. I almost decided to go home. Yeah, like don't let anybody tell you that tear gas is not that bad. It's, it's brutal. And yes, as far as your question about it being effective, it's very effective. I guess the big question is whether it's necessary.
Right. And so I want to kind of, one part of this now that is a necessary part, which is something I also see people talk about, is this issue of looting. And I want to be clear. We're speaking firstly, there is a difference between, like you said, between protesting, rioting, and looting. Those are three different things. And unfortunately, sometimes they all run together. I want you to kind of speak to what you've seen regarding looting and the protests, because I think that we haven't heard from anybody on the front lines about what looting has actually looked like, if it has happened since the first day.
I think the only looting I saw in person was the first day, and it was at the College Football Hall of Fame. And um, I I would hazard a guess to say that, I mean, it was absolutely a very small chunk of the protest population. Um, and, I can't analyze every single person who went in there and why, but I know a lot of people are arguing that, the looters relative to the rioters are, opportunists. There's a difference between setting a cop car on fire to send a message and deciding you need a new, Gucci watch.
Right.
I don't even know if Gucci makes watches, but
They do.
but you know what I'm saying. There's, there are some things that you do because you feel you have to, and there's, I guess, theft is what it boils down to. I just don't think that was a big enough part of the protest to have gotten nearly as much airtime as it did.
Right.
That wasn't representative of the Atlanta that I know.
True. And I think that was the other thing was too, there was this issue of the first night in question, which was this issue of people who went to Phipps Plaza, right? And so anybody who's like not from Atlanta, I think that sometimes when they saw this issue, they're like, people are, they're running through the CNN Center now. They're going to steal high-end luxury goods. And I'm like, whoever's stealing luxury goods from Phipps Plaza is most likely by car at some point, because that's just a long walk to go from.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many miles, like 8 or 9 miles, and it's not a straight line. Like,
Yeah.
it felt very opportunistic. Like, hey, like you said, like somebody's going to kick some sand up here and I'm going to go do something else over there. But they weren't physically close together to even pull that off. But the way the news cut it, watching from TV, it was just like, look, they're storming CNN. And then like the very next cut was just like people running through Phipps Plaza stealing stuff out of like the Dior store and things like that.
Yeah.
And so that was something I'm glad that you kind of corrected, because especially with the College Football Hall of Fame, I didn't even know that was going on. Because a lot of people were just like, oh, they only focus on the luxury goods aspect of it. And that became like the first 48 hours. So that became the notion of the protest, which was peaceful to like stealing Gucci, peaceful to like stealing from Phipps Plaza.
Mm-hmm.
And it just really upset me. And it wasn't until I saw more and more people like yourself on Twitter documenting what's going on, that I was like, okay, you know what? Eventually Sean's stuff or somebody else who's covering will eventually make local news again. But it was just kind of frustrating seeing that over and over and over again on TV in particular.
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry about that, Sean.
Yeah, it's all right. I was just agreeing.
Yeah. And so one thing I do want to ask though is that so you've been out there a few days now. Just a quick question: has the protest died out? Because some people think maybe the protests have died out.
To an extent, I have no way of actually getting a head count on everybody out there. I think every day there have been at least 1,000 people out on.
Oh wow, okay.
Like, yeah, you don't show up pretty much if you show up in the evening before when the curfew was in effect, like an hour before the curfew, it's still a massive protest. And if you see any loss of enthusiasm, I think that is largely due to the fact that people, don't want to get arrested. They got sick of, washing their face out with milk every night. So yeah, I mean, and then also it's spring in Atlanta, man. It's 80 degrees out there.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, a lot of these people have been out there every day from like noon to curfew, and my legs have turned into spaghetti, and I've taken a couple days off.
Yeah.
So no, that's also something I've been thinking a lot about, because in 2016 I covered the Black Lives Matter rallies for Creative Loafing, and I think that was 3 days total.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in other cities like Ferguson, it went on a bit longer and things got more hectic. But something I keep going back to is, why did those end? Like,
Yeah.
a couple of cops were indicted, and I mean, were people just tired? I'm pretty sure in Atlanta after 3 days it rained, and that kind of like dampened the spirits. But we're back again, and there's been a day where it rained a bit and people cheered. Like, people are pissed off, and so right.
Right.
And I don't see the spirits waning. Like, if anything, people are a bit fatigued, but it's like like most other protests, you can you can see a correlation between work days and weekends. Like, when I was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, it's very different than showing up on a Friday night when people have the weekend ahead of them, and if the mayor will allow them, they'll stay out until 3 a.m.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe numbers might be declining. From my perspective, that decline is negligible, but enthusiasm is certainly not.
Okay.
Like, yeah, and I think that's great. I think that's very Atlanta of us, I suppose.
Right. And so I do want to end on this, Sean, which is, I know this is definitely a complete turn from anything, but what have you seen from the protests, or just in general, that's made you happy?
Good question. Because I want to just say the main recurring theme of peace. So I guess this is kind of, I mean, it's a really big question, because a lot of it just warms my heart, seeing thousands of people march down the streets, some holding hands, moving signs. I'm conflicted about whether or not I feel happy when I see protesters and police like linking arms. I know that's a really controversial subject right now. I guess what's making me so happy is that this is still happening. I've been wondering, I said earlier, wondering what's changed since 2016. From where I'm sitting, I don't see police misconduct being scrutinized considerably more than it was 4 years ago. And obviously, a lot of us would like to see that change, but the silver lining right now is that people are still speaking up about it. And it's like this undying flame, and I don't see it flickering anytime soon. So that's keeping me positive. And I guess if we could jump back to the thought about the crowd size and how it's changed, something that I noticed for at least most of the week is that even if the crowd size waned a bit, the militarized police presence didn't change much. And I think that is something that needs a serious microscope over it right now. I mean, it probably cost Atlanta millions of dollars just to outfit all of those troops, to fuel up those monster trucks that probably get 2 miles per gallon.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any room for optimism, I guess it's just that there's still so much promise in this movement.
I like it. And so just last thing, Sean, because we got to wrap up, where can people find you or find your work?
So I guess Twitter is probably the best source to find me and track my stuff. That's the only social media platform that I've been like giving a play-by-play of the protest coverage. And that's at that Sean Keenan. You can also check out Muckrack, which is like a social media for journalists that keeps tabs on all my bylines. I've been doing affordable housing reporting for Saporta Report, and we're also about to launch a nonprofit publication that focuses on affordable housing and the coronavirus and now the fate of democracy, and that's called the Atlanta Civic Circle. I'm a stringer for the New York Times. I'm a regular contributor to Atlanta Magazine. And yeah, if anybody wants to hit me up, you got a story tip, you just want to chat, I'm all ears.
All right. I like it. And so once again, y'all, this is Sean Keenan, and I cannot recommend him enough. Please make sure you follow him on Twitter for all the play-by-play of the protests and all the things he said before. He really is a great reporter. And I'll make sure in the show notes of this that you can hear or see wherever Sean is doing and how to get in contact with him. Once again, thank you for listening to this podcast of the Neighborhood Watch. I am your host, King Williams. If you would like to reach out to me on any social media platform, you can reach out to me. All my social media platforms have the same name, which is at I am King Williams. Or if you haven't already, you can message me or sign up for my newsletter at iamkingwilliams.substack.com. Again, iamkingwilliams.substack.com. Thanks again, Sean.
Thank you, King. I appreciate what you're doing.
All right.